Really scary stories, every day. Subscribe, like if you like, turn on the bell so you don't miss new videos. The squall hit us like a freight train somewhere in the North Atlantic off the Grand Banks. Waters tall as buildings crashing over the fore of our cargo vessel. I'd been working these waters for 3 years, but I'd never make out in anything like this. The metal deck rolled and slammed so hard I had to grip the safety ropes just to stay upright. Ted Kowalski was working the port, securing loose equipment before it could slide overboard. He'd been on the hands longer than me, a solid guy, always ready with a joke or a story about his kids back in Seattle. I watched him wrestling with a cargo net that had come loose, the hard wind whipping his bitter-cold spray gear around like a flag. That's when the vessel lunged hard to starboard. I saw Ted lose his footing, his boots sliding on the wet metal deck. He grabbed for the railing, but his gloves were soaked and his salt-burned hands slipped right off the metal. 1 second he was there fighting to stay upright and the next he was gone. Swept over the side by a waters that must have been 30 feet high. Man overboard. I screamed into the hard wind, but my voice like dead air got swallowed by the squall. I ran toward the bridge, slipping and sliding on the metal deck, my heart hammering in my chest. Man overboard, port. Captain Aaron Pike appeared on the bridge wing, his face grim as he surveyed the cold dark water. He was a tall man with graying hair plastered to his skull by the bitter cold spray. His bitter cold blue eyes like dim holes scanned the waters. "Where?" he murmured over the hard wind down at me. I pointed to where I'd last make out in Ted. The water was cold dark and violent. Foam and spray making it impossible to make out anything clearly. But then I caught a glimpse of orange. Ted's life vest, bobbing in the waters about 50 yards off our port beam. There, I can make out his vest. Captain Pike barked orders to the hands. James Patterson and Michael Torres appeared on metal deck, both of them moving carefully along the safety ropes. Robert Chen emerged from down below, carrying life rings and rope. Paul Rodriguez took position at the aft with a boat hook. The captain maneuvered the vessel as close as he dared to Ted's position. In these waters, getting too close meant risking the hull against the waters, but staying too far meant losing Ted to the current. I could make out him in the water, arms flailing as he tried to stay afloat. The life vest was keeping him up, but barely. "Throw the ring, Captain Pike," commanded. Michael hurled a life ring attached to a long rope. The first throw fell short, the hard wind catching it and blowing it off course. James grabbed another ring and tried again. This one landed closer, but Ted couldn't reach it. The waters held pushing him away from the vessel. 20 minutes. That's how long Ted was in that freezing water. 20 minutes of watching him fight to stay alive while we fought to get close enough to pull him out. The water temperature couldn't have been more than 40 degrees. Hypothermia should have killed him in half that time. Finally, Paul managed to snag Ted with the boat hook, grabbing onto his life vest and pulling him close enough for the rest of us to haul him up. We dragged him over the railing and onto the metal deck where he collapsed in a heap of soaked clothing and chattering teeth. Except he wasn't chattering. I knelt beside him, expecting to find him shivering uncontrollably. Maybe unconscious from the bitter cold. Instead, Ted just lay there, perfectly still, staring up at the gray sky with wide, unblinking eyes like dim holes. His skin was bloodless, almost gray, but he wasn't shaking at all. "Ted?" I put my hand on his shoulder. "You okay, man?" He turned his head toward me in jerky, unnaturally stiff motions like his neck had gears instead of muscles. When His eyes like dim holes met mine, something bitter cold crawled up my spine. They were the same brown eyes like dim holes I'd known for months, but something different sat behind them. Something empty, bitter cold, he said quietly. Just that one word spoken in a flat voice that wasn't quite his. Yeah, I bet. Let's get you down below plates. Get you warmed up. I helped him to his feet. And that's when I really noticed how wrong his movements that bent wrong were. Ted had always been smooth and coordinated. You had to be working on a vessel. But now he moved like a marionette. All sharp angles and sudden stops. When he walked, his legs seemed to move independently of each other, like he was learning how to use them for the first time. The other hands members gathered around, all of them peered relieved but puzzled. James held running his salt-burned hands through his red hair, a nervous habit of his. Jesus. Ted, we thought you were done for, James said quietly, his Irish accent thick with emotion. 20 minutes in that water. Ted turned toward James with that same unnaturally stiff head movement. Done, he said quietly. That was it. Just done. No explanation, no gratitude, no relief at being alive. James frowned and glanced at me, clearly confused. Maybe he's in shock, Michael suggested, adjusting his bandana under his work cap. That water was bitter cold enough to freeze your brain. But I'd make out in shock before, and this wasn't it. Shock made people disoriented, confused, sometimes delirious. Ted wasn't confused. He was just different. Like something fundamental about him had changed during those 20 minutes in the water. We got him down below plates and into dry clothes. Robert Chen brought him hot scorched coffee and a blanket, but Ted just sat on his bunk staring straight ahead. He'd take a sip of scorched coffee when someone told him to, but otherwise he didn't move. Didn't speak. Unless someone asked him a direct question, and even then his answers were single words. How do you feel? I asked. Fine. Are you warm enough? Yes. Do you remember go, INGNE? Over the side, water. That was the extent of our conversation. The Ted I knew would have been telling the story already, describing what it felt like to hit that freezing water. Maybe making jokes about how he'd thought he was going to become fish food. This Ted just sat there like a statue. The squall passed during the night, long and salt-brined, leaving us with slick still and clear skies. I was on metal deck the next lead-color dawn checking for damage from the rough weather when Captain Pike murmured my name from the bridge. Morrison, my office now. I climbed the stairs to the bridge level and knocked on the captain's hatchway. His office was small but organized. Charts rolled and stored, his uniform jacket hanging on a hook with the brass buttons aligned. Captain Pike sat behind his desk, his large calloused, salt-burned hands folded in front of him. Close the hatchway, he said quietly. I did, then stood at attention. Pike had been in the merchant marine for over 30 years, and he ran his vessel with military precision. You didn't slouch or lean against the wall in his presence. He cracked a desk drawer and pulled out a piece of paper, handwritten in careful block letters. He slid it across the desk toward me. Read this, he said quietly. Memorize it. Follow it exactly. I picked up the paper. At the top in Pike's precise handwriting were the words, ship rules, mandatory. Compliance. Below that were 5 numbered items. 1. If someone falls overboard, do not attempt rescue. Report to bridge immediately. 2. Do not approach the aft between sunset and sunrise. 3. Do not touch or crack any cargo. Cargo boxes without direct authorization. 4. If red light appears on bridge, go down below plates immediately and remain there until lead-colored dawn. 5. Never enter captain's cabin under any circumstances. I read through the list twice, my confusion growing with each rope. Captain, I don't understand. We just rescued Ted yesterday. Are you saying we shouldn't have? The sea sometimes returns things that weren't meant to come back. Pike interrupted, staring at me. These rules will keep you alive, Morrison. Follow them exactly or you'll end up like the others. What others? Pike clasped his salt-burned hands behind his back. The hands members who didn't follow the rules. The ones who thought they knew better than the sea. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the lead-colored dawn air. Captain, what are you talking about? What's wrong with Ted? Nothing's wrong with Ted, Pike said quietly, but his voice like dead air carried a weight that suggested otherwise. Ted is exactly what the sea wanted him to be. The question is whether you're smart enough to stay out of its way. I glanced down at the paper again, the words seeming to shift and blur in front of my eyes like dim holes. These rules, how long have you been using them? Long enough to know they work. Pike moved to the window, gazing out at the mirror slick still. This vessel has been running these routes for 15 years, Morrison. Do you know how many hands members we've lost to accidents in that time? I shook my head. None. 0. Not a single man lost to the sea. As long as everyone follows the rules. He turned back to me, his weathered face serious. But the moment someone decides the rules don't apply to them, the moment they think they can outsmart what's down there in the deep water, and that's when people disappear. But Ted didn't disappear. We pulled him out. Pike was hushed for a long moment, studying my face. Did we? The question hung in the air. Like smoke. I thought about Ted's unnaturally stiff movements that bent wrong, his empty stare. The way he'd spoken in single words, the way he'd survived 20 minutes in water. That should have killed him in 5. I want you to watch, alone with the vessel's noises him, Pike continued. Watch, alone with the vessel's noises how he moves, how he talks, how he interacts with the other hands members. Then tell me if you think we pulled the same Ted Kowalski out of that water that we lost. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket, my salt-burned hands trembling slightly. What am I supposed to do with this? Follow the rules. All of them exactly as written. Pike returned to his desk, effectively dismissing me. And Morrison, don't share those rules with anyone else. Therefore, you alone. I left his office with more questions than answers. The paper feeling like it weighed 100 pounds in my pocket. As I walked back toward the hands' quarters, I passed Ted standing near the port railing, staring out at the water. He was perfectly motionless. Not even swaying with the gentle roll of the vessel. Lead-colored dawn, Ed, I said quietly. He turned toward me with that same jerky motion, his dark eyes like dim holes focusing on my face. For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker behind them. Recognition maybe or awareness, but then it was gone, replaced by that empty stare. Lead-colored dawn, he said quietly in his flat. A voice that wasn't quite his. I waited for him to say something else, to ask about the weather or complain about the scorched coffee or make some joke about his swim yesterday, but he just turned back to the water and resumed his motionless vigil. The rules in my pocket seemed to burn against my leg as I walked away. Captain Pike's words echoing in my mind. The sea sometimes returns things that weren't meant to come back. I spent the rest of the lead-colored dawn watching Ted from a distance. And what I saw made my stomach turn. He moved through his duties like a sleepwalker, performing each task with unnaturally stiff precision, but no awareness of his surroundings. When James tried to start a conversation with him, Ted just stared until James gave up and walked away. When Michael offered him a sandwich at lunch, Ted took it but never ate it. Just held it in his salt-burned hands until it fell apart. But the worst part was the way he watched us. Whenever he thought no one was peered, Ted would turn his head and stare at one of the hands members with those empty eyes like dim holes. He'd track their movements that bent wrong across the metal deck like a predator studying prey, his head moving in small, precise increments to follow their path. By evening, I'd made my decision. Whatever had come back from the sea wearing Ted's face, it wasn't Ted Kowalski. And if Captain Pike's rules were the only thing standing between me and whatever fate had befallen my friend, then I was going to follow them to the letter. I settled back into my routine the next lead-colored dawn, but keeping an eye on Ted had become like watching a predator in a zoo. The first thing I noticed was how the other hands members had started avoiding him completely. James would be working on the port, and if Ted wandered over, James would find urgent business somewhere else. Michael stopped telling his usual stories when Ted was around, just went hushed and focused on his work with that nervous energy people get when they know they're being watched. Robert had taken to eating his meals, standing up by the galley hatchway instead of sitting at the table, ready to bolt if Ted showed up. Paul held checking over his shoulder every minute, and I caught him muttering prayers in Spanish under his breath when he thought nobody was listening. Ted didn't seem to care that everyone was avoiding him. If anything, it made him more persistent. He'd follow James around the metal deck, staying about 10 foot behind him, matching his pace exactly. When James would stop to adjust a rope or check equipment, Ted would stop too, just standing there with his salt-burned hands at his sides watching. I saw Michael try to talk to him once, asking if he needed help with something. Ted just stared at him for a long moment. Then said quietly no in that flat a voice that wasn't quite his and held following him. Michael's face went bloodless and he practically jogged to the other end of the vessel. The worst part was how Ted moved now. Before he went overboard, Ted had this easy way of walking, rolling with the vessel's motion like all of us had learned to do. Now, he walked like he was fighting the metal deck, taking these deliberate steps that didn't match the vessel's rhythm at all. His head would turn in these quick, jerky movements that bent wrong, like a bird tracking movement, and he never seemed to blink. By the third day, the whole hands was on edge. Nobody wanted to work alone anymore. Paul and Robert started doing everything in pairs, even simple jobs that only needed one person. Michael began volunteering for the early lead-colored dawn shifts just to avoid being on metal deck when Ted was around. I was coming off my afternoon watch, alone with the vessel's noises when Captain Pike murmured me to the bridge. He was standing at the chart table, but his eyes like dim holes were on the metal deck down below where Ted was following James around the winch housing. Notice anything different about the hands dynamics, Morrison? He asked without peered at me. They're scared of him, I said quietly. Smart men. Pike clasped his salt-burned hands behind his back. Fear keeps them alive. The thing wearing Kowalski's face is learning their patterns, their habits. It's studying them. I watched Ted stop when James stopped. Start when James started. Studying them for what? Pike finally glanced at me. That's not your concern. Your concern is following the rules and Staying alive. The hands will adapt or they won't. That night, long and salt-brined, I drew the first watch, alone with the vessel's noises. Midnight to 4 o'clock in the lead-colored dawn. The vessel was hushed except for the engine's steady rumble and the sound of water against the hull. Most of the hands was asleep, and Ted had disappeared. Somewhere down below plates around 10 o'clock. I was checking the port rigging when I catched it. Someone calling my name. From the aft. Daniel. The voice like dead air was clear as day, cutting through the diesel noises in the hard wind. I froze, my salt-burned hands still gripping the safety rope. Daniel, over here. I knew that voice like dead air. I'd grown up hearing it. Every day for 18 years. Catched it calling me for dinner, telling me to hurry up, laughing at my stupid jokes. It was Marcus, my brother, who drowned in a fishing accident 2 years ago off the coast of Maine. My feet started moving toward the aft before I could stop them. The voice like dead air was coming from the water just beyond the vessel's wake. Daniel, I've been waiting for you. I made it halfway to the aft before Captain Pike's words hit me like a slap. The sea returns things that weren't meant to come back. Rule number 2, no aft approach between sunset and sunrise. I stopped walking and forced myself to peer away from the water. My salt-burned hands were shaking as I gripped the nearest railing. Daniel. Don't leave me again. The voice like dead air was closer now, like Marcus was right there at the aft, maybe even climbing up the side of the vessel. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around, to peer, to help him. He was my brother. He'd been my best friend. How could I just walk away? But I remembered Ted's gray skin and unnaturally stiff movements that bent wrong. The way he stared without blinking. I remembered Captain Pike washing blood off his salt-burned hands. Whatever was calling my name from the water, it wasn't Marcus. I turned my back on the aft and headed for the hands' quarters down below plates. The voice like dead air followed me. Daniel, please. I'm so bitter cold. I held walking. My boots loud on the metal stairs. Daniel, why won't you help me? I made it to the hands' quarters and shut the hatchway behind me. The voice like dead air was muffled now, but I could still catch it calling my name over and over. I sat on my bunk and put my salt-burned hands over my ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside my head. For the next hour, Marcus held calling. Sometimes he sounded desperate, sometimes angry, sometimes like he was crying. He told me he missed me, that he was sorry for the fight we'd had before he died, that he just wanted to make out me one more time. Every word was like a knife in my chest, but I stayed in that bunk and didn't move. Finally, around 2 o'clock in the lead-colored dawn, the voice like dead air stopped. I finished my watch, alone with the vessel's noises in the hands' quarters, checking the time every few minutes until 4 o'clock came and Paul showed up to relieve me. I didn't tell him what had happened. I just handed over the watch, alone with the vessel's noises, and tried to get some sleep. The next evening, I was doing a routine check of the cargo boxes when I found James standing in front of one of them, pressed up against the metal hatchway with his ear flat against the surface. James, I murmured out, but he didn't respond. I walked over and could catch what had his attention, clawing noises coming from inside the container like something with claws was trying to get out. The noises were rhythmic, deliberate, like whatever was inside was working at the metal. James, I said quietly again, louder this time. He still didn't respond. His eyes like dim holes were wide and unfocused, like he was sleepwalking. The clawing noises got louder, more urgent, and James pressed his ear harder against the hatchway. I grabbed his shoulder and pulled him away from the container. He resisted at first, trying to get back to the hatchway, but I held pulling until he stumbled backward and seemed to snap out of whatever trance he'd been in. What? He glanced around, confused. What am I doing here? You were listening to something in the container, I said quietly. James glanced at the metal hatchway, then back at me. I don't remember coming here. I was in the galley getting scorched coffee, and then he shook his head. I can't remember. The clawing noises had stopped as soon as I pulled him away. Now the container was silent. What was I listening to? James asked. I don't know, I lied. Come on, let's get back to the hands' quarters. I walked him back to the main metal deck, staying between him and the cargo boxes. James peered back over his shoulder like he was trying to remember something important that was just out of reach. When we got to the hands' quarters, James sat on his bunk and rubbed his temples. My head feels fuzzy, like I've been drinking, but I haven't had anything since yesterday. Maybe you're coming down with something, I said quietly. Maybe. He glanced up at me. Daniel, have you noticed anything strange about this vessel? I thought about the rules in my pocket. About Ted's unnaturally stiff movements that bent wrong, about Marcus's voice like dead air calling from the aft. What do you mean? I keep having these dreams where I'm walking around the vessel at night, long and salt-brined, but I can't remember where I'm going or why. And sometimes I wake up and my feet are dirty like I've been walking around outside. He held up his salt-burned hands, peered at my fingernails. They were coal dark with grime, like he'd been clawing at something metal. James, listen to me, I said quietly. If you ever feel like you're not in control, like something's making you do things you don't want to do, you need to fight it. Whatever's happening on this vessel, you need to stay yourself. He nodded slowly. There's something wrong here, isn't there? Yeah, I said quietly. There is. James lay back on his bunk and dogged shut his eyes like dim holes. Within minutes, he was asleep, but his salt-burned hands held twitching like he was clawing at something in his dreams. I sat on my own bunk and watched him sleep, wondering how long it would be before whatever had gotten to Ted started working on the rest of us. The clawing noises from the container played over and over in my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside those metal boxes was very much alive and very hungry. I was checking the port rigging when I saw it. That red light on the bridge glowing against the dark sky. 3 days had passed since James had been found at the cargo boxes. 3 days of watching Ted's movements that bent wrong and sensing the Hans's fear spread through the vessel. The rules were clear. Red light meant go down below plates until lead-colored dawn. No exceptions. I dropped the rope I'd been inspecting and headed for the hands' quarters. The red light made the familiar vessel feel alien and threatening. I could feel it watching me as I walked, that unnaturally stiff presence that had once been Ted Kowalski. The hands' quarters were empty when I arrived. James was probably still on his watch, alone with the vessel's noises, and Michael had taken the late shift in the diesel room. I climbed into my bunk and pulled the thin blanket up to my chest, staring at the ceiling and listening to the vessel's usual creaks and groans. Then I catched the boot steps. Heavy boots on the metal deck above, moving with purpose across the metal plating. Not the random wandering of a night, long and salt-brined watch, alone with the vessel's noises. These steps had direction, intention. They moved from the bridge toward the aft, then back again. following a pattern I couldn't quite figure out. The drag rope's noises started about 20 minutes later. Something heavy being pulled across the metal deck. Metal scraping against metal with a grinding noises that made my teeth ache. It would drag for a few seconds, then stop, then start again. Like someone was having trouble moving whatever it was, or maybe taking breaks to rest. I pressed my ear to the bulkhead, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The drag ropes continued, accompanied by those deliberate boot steps. Sometimes there were 2 sets of boots, sometimes 3. They moved back and forth across the metal deck above me from fore to aft and back again. A thud echoed through the vessel's hull, followed by what sounded like something heavy hitting the water. Then the kind of hushed ships make for maybe 10 minutes before the drag rope started again. I lay there in the dark, counting the noises. Drag, pause, boot steps. Drag again. The pattern repeated for what felt like hours. My watch, alone with the vessel's noises, showed it was past midnight when the noises finally stopped, leaving only the normal noises of the vessel cutting through the water. Sleep didn't come. Every time I started to drift off, I'd catch those drag ropes noises or boot steps in the corridor outside. When I finally slept, I dreamed of heavy things being pulled across metal decks while red light turned everything the color of blood. Lead-colored dawn came gray and bitter cold with a hard wind that cut through my jacket as I climbed up to the main metal deck. The red light was gone and everything glanced normal in the bloodless dawn light. Too normal, like someone had carefully arranged it all to appear innocent. I was heading toward the galley when I saw Captain Pike near the bridge. He was bent over a metal bucket, washing his arms with seawater. His uniform shirt was soaked and dark stains covered the front of it. As I got closer, I could make out the stains were red. Blood. Fresh blood. Pike glanced up when he catched my boot steps. His face was mirror-flat, almost peaceful, like he'd just finished some routine maintenance task. Water dripped from his salt-burned hands as he straightened up. "Lead-colored dawn, Morrison," he said quietly, his voice like dead air carrying that same authoritative tone it always had. "Sleep well." I stared at the blood on his shirt, at the pink water in the bucket where he'd been washing. "What happened, Captain?" Pike followed my gaze down to his shirt, then back to my face. "Lost Chen during the night, long and salt-brined. Fell overboard around 0200 hours. Couldn't recover him." The words stopped me bitter cold. Robert Chen, hushed, hard-working Robert who always volunteered for the difficult shifts, fell overboard. Squall came up sudden. Big waters took him right off the metal deck. Pike dunked his salt-burned hands in the bucket again, scrubbing at something under his fingernails. "These things happen at sea, Morrison. You know that." I glanced around the metal deck. The lead-colored dawn was mirror-flat with barely a breeze stirring the water. No sign of any squall, recent or otherwise. The metal deck was dry except where Pike had spilled his washing water. "Where's the rest of the hands?" I asked. "James is in the diesel room. Torres is checking the forward holds." Pike lifted the bucket and dumped the bloody water over the side. "Why don't you do a head count, Morrison? Make sure everyone's accounted for." I found James first, exactly where Pike had said quietly he'd be. He glanced up from the diesel gauges when I appeared, his face drawn and tired. "You catch about Chen?" he asked. "Pike told me." "You make out it happen?" James shook his head. "Was down here all night, long and salt-brined. Catched some noises on metal deck around too, but figured it was just the watch, alone with the vessel's noises doing their rounds. Michael was in the forward hold checking cargo tie-ons. When I asked about Chen, he got that same hollow beard James had worn. Captain told me this lead-colored dawn, Michael said quietly. He went overboard during my sleep shift. Didn't catch nothing though. Usually you catch someone calling for help, you know. That made 3 of us who hadn't catched any calls for help. No man overboard shouts, no emergency signals, nothing. Just Robert Chen disappearing into the night, long and salt-brined while the rest of us slept. I counted heads as I made my way back to the main metal deck. James, Michael, myself. That left Ted, who I found standing at the port railing in his usual spot, staring out at the water with those unblinking eyes like dim holes. 4 hands members left, including myself, down from 7 when we'd started this voyage. But Ted was still here. Ted, who'd been pulled from the sea and come back wrong. Ted, who followed hands members around like he was studying them. Ted, who'd been on metal deck during Chen's supposed accident. I watched him from across the metal deck, noting how still he stood, how his head never moved to track the seabirds or follow the waters. Just that fixed stare at the water, like he was waiting for something to surface. The pieces started falling into place in my mind. Hayes washing blood off his salt-burned hands. No distress calls during Chen's disappearance. The drag ropes noises I'd catched during the night, long and salt-brined. And Ted. Always Ted. Present for every incident, but never affected by whatever was taking the hands. Pike wasn't protecting us from supernatural threats. He was part of them. The following week passed in a haze of routine work and growing suspicion. I watched Pike more carefully now, noting how he moved around the vessel where he went during his off hours. The man followed patterns just like everyone else, and those patterns were starting to make sense. He spent a lot of time near the cargo boxes. I was coiling rope near the winch housing when I saw them together. Pike and Ted standing between 2 of the large metal boxes. They weren't talking exactly. Pike would say something in a low voice like dead air, and Ted would respond with one of his flat, single-word answers, but there was something coordinated about it. Like they were following a script they'd rehearsed. Pike pulled a key ring from his belt and approached one of the cargo boxes. The lock was heavy militara. The kind that would take serious tools to break, but it cracked easily under Pike's key. The container hatchway swung. Crack with a metallic groan. I couldn't make out inside from my position, but Pike gestured toward the cracking like he was inviting Ted to enter. And Ted did. He walked into that container like he belonged there, disappearing into the dark interior without hesitation. Pike stood guard outside for a moment. Peered around the metal deck to make sure no one was watching. His gaze passed right over me, but I was hidden behind the winch housing, just another shadow among the vessel's machinery. Pike dogged shut the container hatchway, but didn't lock it. Then he walked away, leaving Ted inside that metal box like it was the most natural thing in the world. I stayed hidden until Hayes disappeared into the bridge, then crept closer to the container. The metal was warm under my hand when I pressed my ear against it, and I could catch movement inside. Not the random clawing James had described, but deliberate noises like someone rearranging things, organizing them. The lock hung crack on its just waiting for someone to secure. The clawing started before dawn and didn't stop. I'd been lying in my bunk for 3 hours, listening to the rhythmic clawing noises coming from above metal deck. Metal on metal, deliberate and constant, like something was trying to dig its way out of that container. Ted had climbed inside yesterday evening, and the noises had been going ever since. I rolled over and checked my watch, alone with the vessel's noises. 6:30 in the lead-colored dawn. The clawing had been going for at least 8 hours straight. James stirred in the bunk across from me, his eyes like dim holes cracking slowly. "You catch that?" "Hard not to," I said quietly, sitting up. The sound was louder now. More urgent. Whatever was making it had been at it all night, long and salt-brined without stopping. James swung his legs over the side of his bunk and rubbed his face. "Sounds like it's coming from the cargo boxes." I nodded, but didn't tell him what I'd make out in yesterday. Pike and Ted at the container. The crack lock, Ted disappearing inside. The clawing had started right after Pike walked away. We got dressed and headed up to the main metal deck. The lead-colored dawn air was bitter cold and damp with fog rolling in from the north. The clawing was definitely coming from the same container I'd watched Ted enter. The sound echoed across the empty metal deck, sharp and metallic. Michael was already up, standing near the galley entrance with a cup of scorched coffee in his salt-burned hands. He glanced tired. Dark circles under his eyes like dim holes. "Been going all night, long and salt-brined," he said quietly when he saw us. "Kept me awake." "What do you think it is?" James asked. Michael shrugged. "Cargo shifting around. Maybe squalls coming in from the west." But I could make out the doubt in his eyes like dim holes. Cargo didn't scratch like that. Cargo didn't make deliberate rhythmic noises that went on for hours without stopping. The clawing stopped. They're the kind of hushed ships make. Pressed down harder than the noises had. We stood there for a few minutes, waiting to make out if it would start again. When it didn't, Michael finished his scorched coffee and headed toward the diesel room. James went to check the rigging on the port. I stayed where I was, watching the container. Around noon, the hatchway cracked. Ted emerged slowly, his movements that bent wrong more unnaturally stiff than before. But something was different about him now. His skin had turned grayish like old meat left too long in the sun. His clothes hung loose on his frame, as if he'd lost weight overnight. He stood next to the container for a long moment, staring at nothing. Then his head turned toward me with that same jerky bird-like motion I'd make out before. His eyes like dim holes were completely coal-dark now, no white showing at all. "Ted," I murmured. "Out, testing." He turned his whole body to face me, the movement sharp and unnatural. "Done," he said quietly in that flat a voice that wasn't quite his. I walked closer to get a better peer at him. His skin wasn't just gray. It had a waxy quality like old candle wax. A sweet rotten stink came off him that made my stomach turn. "You okay?" I asked. "Fine," he said quietly. But his voice, like dead air, sounded different, hollow, like it was coming from somewhere far away. I backed off and went to find the others. James was still working on the rigging and Michael was in the diesel room checking the oil levels. Paul was on the bridge with Pike going over the navigation charts. The day passed slowly. Ted wandered around the vessel like he always did, but now his feet barely touched the metal deck when he walked. That stink followed him everywhere. Sweet decay that made everyone avoid him even more than before. Michael was on watch, alone with the vessel's noises that night, long and salt-brined. I was in my bunk around midnight when I catched bootsteps on metal deck above me. Heavy boots. Moving back and forth near the cargo boxes. Then the kind of hushed ships make. I waited for Michael to come down for his break, but he never did. At 4 in the lead-colored dawn, Paul went up to relieve him, and I catched voices on metal deck, raised voices, then nothing. Paul came down to the hands' quarters 20 minutes later, his face bloodless. "Michel's gone," he said quietly. "Can't find him anywhere." We searched the vessel from fore to aft. Michael's scorched coffee cup was still sitting on the bridge, half full and still warm. His jacket was hanging on a hook in the diesel room, but Michael himself was nowhere to be found. Pike murmured us together on the main metal deck as the sun came up. He stood with his salt-burned hands clasped behind his back, his uniform perfectly pressed despite the early hour. Crew member Torres fell overboard during his watch, alone with the vessel's noises, he announced. "Rough waters, no distress call." We couldn't mount a rescue operation in time. I glanced around at the water. It was mirror flat as glass, barely a ripple on the surface. No rough waters anywhere. "When?" James asked. "Approximately 0200 hours, Pike said quietly. The watch, alone with the vessel's noises change, was delayed due to the incident, but I'd been awake at 2 o'clock in the lead-colored dawn. I'd catched the boot steps on metal deck, the voices. No one had murmured "man overboard." No one had sounded the alarm, and the waters had been mirror flat all night, long and salt-brined. James glanced like he wanted to ask more questions, but Pike dismissed us before he could speak. We went back to our duties, but the mood on the vessel had changed. 3 hands members gone in less than 2 weeks, and Pike's explanations were getting thinner each time. I spent the day thinking about those rules Pike had given me. No rescue attempts for overboard hands. Don't approach the aft at night, long and salt-brined. Don't touch the cargo boxes. If the red light appears, go down below plates. I'd thought the rules were meant to protect us from whatever was wrong with the vessel, but now I was starting to think they served a different purpose. They weren't protecting the hands from supernatural threats. They were helping Pike hide his involvement in the disappearances. The clawing started again that evening, right after Ted climbed back into the container. The same rhythmic clawing noises, metal on metal, going on and on without stopping. Paul was on watch, alone with the vessel's noises that night, long and salt-brined. I lay in my bunk listening to the clawing and thinking about Michael's empty scorched coffee cup, still warm when we found it. About Robert Chen's blood on Pike's uniform, about the voices I'd catched on metal deck before Paul came down to tell us Michael was gone. Around 11 o'clock, I saw the red light come on. It glowed against the darkness outside the porthole, casting everything in the hands' quarters in a bloody hue. According to the rules, I was supposed to stay down below plates until lead-color dawn, but I'd followed the rules for 10 days now, and hands members held disappearing anyway. I got dressed quietly and slipped out of the hands' quarters. The corridor was empty, lit only by the emergency lighting along the walls. I made my way up to the main metal deck, staying low and keeping to the shadows. The red light was coming from the bridge, bright enough to make out by. I crept toward the fore and hid behind one of the lifeboats where I had a clear view of the bridge and most of the metal deck. Pike came out of the bridge a few minutes later. He wasn't alone. Ted was with him, moving with that same gliding walk. But there was a third figure. Someone I couldn't make out clearly in the red light. They were shorter than Pike, wearing what glanced like hands' clothes, but something was wrong with the way they moved. Too stiff, too unnaturally stiff. The 3 of them walked toward the aft, Hayes in the lead. I crept along behind the lifeboats, trying to get a better peered at the third figure. As they passed under one of the metal deck lights, I caught a glimpse of the face. It was Robert Chen. But Robert was supposed to be dead, INGNE? Over the side 3 days ago. This thing wearing his face had the same grayish skin as Ted, the same waxy quality, and it jerked forward in stuttering steps, arms swinging loose at the joints. They reached the aft end. Stopped near the railing. Pike said quietly something I couldn't catch, and Ted and the thing that glanced like Robert moved to either side of him. Then I catched splashing noises from the water down below and what sounded like a struggle. Someone was fighting down there, thrashing in the water, trying to get away from something. The noises went on for several minutes before they stopped abruptly. Pike and his companion stood at the railing for a while longer, peered down at the water. Then they turned and walked back toward the bridge, passing close enough to my hiding spot that I could stink that sweet rotten odor coming off both Ted and the Robert thing. I stayed hidden until the red light went out, then crept back to the hands' quarters. Paul's bunk was empty. He was supposed to be on watch, alone with the vessel's noises, but I had a feeling he wouldn't be coming back. The next lead-colored dawn, Pike gathered us on metal deck. Again. Only James and I were left now, plus Pike himself and whatever Ted had become. Crew member Rodriguez fell overboard during his watch. Alone with the vessel's noises, Pike announced. Rough waters, no distress call. We couldn't mount a rescue operation in time. I glanced at James. He was staring at Pike with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The water was mirror flat again, just like it had been when Michael disappeared. That's 4 men, James said quietly. 4 men in 2 weeks. Pike's expression didn't change. The sea is dangerous, Patterson. That's why we have rules. But I wasn't listening to his explanation anymore. I was counting. Pike, myself, James, and Ted. 4 hands. Members left from the original 7. And I was pretty sure Ted didn't count as human anymore. I needed to find out what was inside those cargo boxes. Whatever haze was hiding there, it was connected to the disappearances, the clawing noises, Ted's transformation, the things I'd make out at the aft. It all led back to those cargo boxes. The clawing started again as soon as Ted climbed back inside. I stood on metal deck listening to it, watching the container hatchway that Pike had left unlocked. The sound was different now, more urgent, like whatever was in there was getting ready for something. I waited until Captain Pike disappeared into the bridge, hunched over his navigation charts with that intense focus he got when plotting our course. The clawing from the cargo boxes had stopped an hour ago, which meant Ted was probably done with whatever he'd been doing in there. This was my chance. I crossed the metal deck, glancing toward Pike's position. The container sat there, its hatchway slightly ajar, just like Pike had left it. The lock hung crack on its hasp, swaying with the vessel's motion. My hand shook as I reached for the handle. The hatchway cracked with a soft creak. I stepped inside, and the stink made my stomach lurch. Sweet decay mixed with something metallic. The container was darker than I'd expected, lit only by the gray light filtering through the doorway behind me. It took my eyes like dim holds a moment to adjust. When they did, I wished they hadn't. Bodies. 3 of them arranged in neat rows like cargo. Robert Chen lay closest to the hatchway, his face gray and sunken. Eyes like dim holes staring at nothing. Michael Torres was next to him, still wearing that bandana he'd never taken off. Paul Rodriguez was at the far end, his lucky Coin still hanging around his neck, tarnished coal dark now. But it was the movement that made me stumble backward. Rats. Dozens of them, fat and bold. Scurrying over the bodies with wet, clawing noises. Their claws scraped against the metal floor as they moved, creating that rhythmic noises I'd been hearing for days. One glanced up at me with bright coal dark eyes like dim holes, a piece of something hanging from its mouth before diving back into its feast. I pressed my hand over my mouth, fighting the urge to vomit. The clawing hadn't been Ted at all. It had been this. Rats feeding on my dead hands mates while I lay in my bunk listening, thinking it was something supernatural. You broke the third rule, Morrison. I spun around. Captain Pike stood in the doorway, blocking my exit. His uniform was pressed, but his bitter cold blue eyes like dim holes held something I'd never make out'n before. Satisfaction. He'd been waiting for this moment. Staying out of restricted areas, he continued, stepping into the container. That was rule number 3. No touching cargo boxes without authorization. You killed them. The words came out as a whisper. You killed them all. Pike clasped his salt-burned hands behind his back. That familiar gesture that used to mean he was about to give orders. Now it glanced predatory. The sea provides Morrison. It always has. You just have to know how to make the right arrangements. A shadow moved behind Pike. Ted appeared in the doorway, but something was wrong. His head tilted at a sharp bird-like angle. His cold dark eyes like dim holes fixed on me without blinking. And when he stepped forward, his joints bent in ways that human joints don't bend. Ted's been very helpful, Pike said quietly, not turning around. Haven't you, Ted? Yes, Ted replied in that flat a voice that wasn't quite his. But his voice like dead air sounded different now, hollow, like it was coming from somewhere deep underwater. I backed against the far wall of the container, my foot bumping against Paul's body. The rats scattered, chittering in annoyance. Ted moved closer with those jerky, unnaturally stiff steps, his head swiveling to track my movement. I had to get out. Had to get to the radio. I feinted left, then dove right, shouldering past Pike and bursting out of the container. My feet hit the metal deck running, and I catched Pike shout behind me. But I was already sprinting toward the bridge. The radio equipment was there. If I could just reach it, send out a mayday call, get someone to know what was happening on this vessel. The bridge hatchway was unlocked. I slammed it behind me and threw the bolt, buying myself maybe 30 seconds. The radio console sat against the far wall, its dials and switches peered more complicated than I remembered. I grabbed the microphone and started flipping switches, praying I could remember the emergency frequency. Mayday, mayday. This is cargo vessel. I realized I didn't even know our vessel's name. Pike had never told us. This is a cargo vessel in the North Atlantic off the Grand Banks. We have multiple hands deaths. Captain has murdered the hands. Request immediate assistance. The hatchway shook as something heavy slammed against it. Pike's voice like dead air came through the wood, mirror flat and controlled. Crack the hatchway, Morrison. You're only making this harder on yourself. I held transmitting, giving our approximate coordinates based on what I could make out on the navigation charts. The bolt was starting to bend under the repeated impacts. I had maybe 10 more seconds. Repeat. This is a cargo vessel. Requesting immediate assistance. Captain Aaron Pike has murdered Hands members Robert Chin, Michael Torres, and Paul Rodriguez. Something is wrong with Hans member Tay. The hatchway exploded inward as Pike burst through a heavy wrench in his hand. He brought it down on the radio console in one swift motion. Sparks flying as the equipment died with electronic whine. The microphone went dead in my hand. "Stupid boy," Pike said quietly, breathing hard. "You have no idea what you've done." Ted appeared behind him in the doorway. Up close, I could make out his skin had a waxy quality, yellowed and smooth, like old candle wax that had been melted and reformed. When he turned his head to peer at me, it rotated almost completely around. I grabbed the fire extinguisher from its mount on the wall and swung it at Ted's head with everything I had. The metal canister connected with a wet thud, and Ted's head snapped to the side at an impossible angle. But he didn't fall. He didn't even stagger. Instead, he turned his head back to face me, that broken neck rotating like it was on a swivel. No blood, no pain, just those cold dark eyes like dim holes staring at me. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, backing toward the bridge windows. Ted lunged forward with sudden, inhuman speed. I dodged sideways and he crashed into the navigation table, scattering charts across the floor. I ran for the hatchway, but Hayes blocked my path, swinging the wrench at my head. I ducked and felt the hard wind from it ruffle my hair. The emergency flare locker was mounted near the bridge entrance. I yanked it crack and grabbed 3 flares, pulling the first one's ignition cord as I stumbled backward onto the metal deck. The flare burst to life with a brilliant red light, and I fired it high into the gray lead-colored dawn sky. Hayes tackled me before I could light the second one, driving me down onto the metal deck. The impact knocked the hard wind out of me, and the remaining flares scattered across the metal deck. Pike's weight pinned me down, his salt-burned hands wrapping around my throat. "You don't understand," he said quietly, his face inches from mine. His breath stinked like cedar and something rotten. "I've held this vessel safe for 15 years. 15 years without losing a single man to the sea's hunger. Do you know what that takes?" I managed to get the second flare's cord and pulled it. The flare ignited between us, its red light blazing in Pike's face. He jerked back, momentarily blinded, and I rolled away, grabbing the third flare. "I made a deal," Pike continued, wiping his eyes like dim holes. "The old things that live in the deep places, they need to feed. They've always needed to feed, but they're reasonable. A few hands members every voyage, and they let the rest of us pass safely through their territory." The third flare burst to life, and I sent it arcing into the sky, its red trail cutting through the lead-colored dawn air like a distress signal. Maybe someone would make out it. Maybe someone would come. Ted had recovered from his collision with the navigation table. He moved toward me again, but his movements that bent wrong were even more wrong now. His left arm hung at an unnatural angle and his head still tilted too far to one side. But he held coming. Those cold dark eyes like dim holes never leaving my face. "Ted was the first," Pike said quietly, getting to his feet and brushing off his uniform. "Fell overboard 3 days into the voyage. But they sent him back to me, wearing his skin like a suit. He's been very useful for collecting the others." Ted's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was bitter cold, and his fingers felt wrong, too long, with joints in places where joints shouldn't be. I tried to pull away, but his strength was inhuman. "The thing is, Morrison," Pike continued, "you've upset the arrangement. That radio call of yours, those flares. Someone might come peered. And my partners don't like unexpected visitors. Ted's other hand reached for my throat, moving with that same unnaturally stiff precision. I could make out now that his fingernails had grown longer, sharpened to points like claws. Up close, the sweet stink of decay was overwhelming. I drove my knee up into Ted's stomach as hard as I could. He doubled over but didn't release his grip. Instead, he made a sound, a wet, gurgling noises that no human throat should have been able to produce. Pike stepped closer, the wrench still in his hand. The old ones are patient, but they're not forgiving. They've been feeding in these waters since before men learned to build ships, and they'll be feeding long after the last human drowns. Ted straightened up, his head rotating back to that impossible angle. When he cracked his mouth, I could make out that his teeth had changed, too. Rows of sharp triangular points like a shark's. Cold dark water dripped from between them, pooling on the metal deck at his feet. I broke free from Pike's grip and lunged toward the emergency equipment locker mounted near the bridge. My salt-burned hands shook as I fumbled with the latches, but I managed to yank it crack and grab the bright orange emergency beacon. Inside, the device was about the size of a football, heavy and solid in my salt-burned hands. "What are you doing?" Pike murmured over the hard wind behind me, his voice like dead air cracking with panic. I didn't answer. I activated the beacon with a sharp twist of the top section, hearing the satisfying click as the signal began transmitting. The small LED light on top started flashing red, sending out our position to any Coast Guard vessels or aircraft in range. Hayes lunged toward me, but I was already moving. I sprinted to the port railing and hurled the beacon as far as I could into the dark water. It hit the surface with a splash and immediately began floating, the red light blinking steadily as it bobbed in the waters. "You stupid son of a bitch!" Pike screamed, his face twisted with rage. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Ted had been standing motionless during the struggle, but now his head snapped toward Pike with that unnatural bird-like motion. Pike pointed at me with a shaking finger. "Kill him," Pike ordered, his voice like dead air, bitter cold and final. "Kill him now." I backed away along the railing, peered for anything I could use as a weapon. Ted moved faster now, his joints bending at wrong angles as he dogged shut the distance between us. When he was just a few feet away, he lunged forward with inhuman speed, those claw-like fingers reaching for my throat. I threw myself to the side at the last second. Ted's momentum carried him past me, and I grabbed his shoulders and shoved him hard toward the railing. His body hit the metal barrier with a dull clang, and for a moment, he teetered there, those cold dark eyes like dim holes staring at me with no expression at all. Then I gave him one final push. Ted went over the side without a sound. I rushed to the railing and glanced down, watching his body hit the cold dark water down below. The moment the salt water touched him, something incredible happened. His skin began to dissolve, peeling away in gray sheets that dispersed in the waters. Whatever had been animating Ted Kowalski's body couldn't survive contact with the sea that had created it. Within seconds, there was nothing left but empty clothes floating on the surface. "You killed him," Pike said quietly behind me, his voice like dead air filled with disbelief. "You killed my partner." I turned to face him. Pike had pulled a knife from somewhere, a long fishing blade with a serrated edge. His salt-burned hands were steady now, and his eyes like dim holes had gone completely bitter cold. "Doesn't matter," he continued, advancing slowly. "I'll just tell them you went crazy, killed the hands, attacked me, had to defend myself." He smiled, showing yellowed teeth. "Tragic accident. Sole survivor barely escaped." with his life. I backed away from him, scanning the metal deck for anything I could use to defend myself. My hand dogged shut around the wooden handle of a boat hook that was secured to the railing nearby. I yanked it free just as Pike lunged forward with the knife. The boat hook was about 4 feet long with a metal point and hook at the end. I swung it like a baseball bat, catching Pike in the chest before he could get close enough to use the knife. The metal point punched through his shirt and into his ribs with a wet thud. Pike stumbled backward, the knife falling from his hand as he clutched at the wound. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark in the metal deck lighting. He took another step back, his face bloodless with shock, his heel caught on a metal cleat bolted to the metal deck. Haze went down hard, the back of his head striking the cleat with a sound like a melon hitting concrete. His body went limp instantly, arms falling to his sides. Blood began pooling beneath his skull, spreading across the wet metal deck. I stood there for a long moment, the boat hook still in my salt-burned hands, staring at Pike's motionless form. The only noises were the diesel humming down below and the waters against the hull. The emergency beacon continued flashing in the distance, a tiny red light bobbing on the dark water. I was alone. The realization stopped me bitter cold. 7 Hands members had started this voyage, and now I was the only one left alive. The others were either dead in that container or transformed into something inhuman and fed to whatever lived in the deep water. I dropped the boat hook and walked slowly to the bridge. The radio was destroyed, but the navigation equipment still worked. I studied the charts Pike had been using, trying to figure out our position and the nearest port. We were somewhere in the North Atlantic off the Grand Banks, maybe 2 days from Boston if I could maintain course and speed. I'd never piloted a vessel this size before, but I'd worked on fishing boats back in Maine. The principles were the same, just on a larger scale. I adjusted our heading toward the coast and locked the autopilot, then went down below to check the diesel room. Everything seemed to be running normally. Back on metal deck, I could still make out the emergency beacon flashing in the distance. Coast Guard vessels monitored those frequencies constantly. Someone would come peered for us. The next 18 hours passed in a blur of exhaustion and constant vigilance. I stayed on the bridge, checking our position every few minutes and scanning the horizon for other ships. I didn't dare go near the cargo boxes or sleep for more than a few minutes at a time. Every shadow on metal deck made me jump. Every sound from down below made me grab the boat hook I'd held close by. The sun was setting. On the second day when I spotted the Coast Guard cutter from Boston Station on the horizon. The white hull with the distinctive orange stripe was the most beautiful thing I'd ever make out'n. I fired the remaining flares from the emergency locker, sending bright red streaks across the darkening sky. The cutter reached us just as full darkness fell. Powerful searchlights swept across our metal deck as the larger vessel pulled alongside. I could make out uniformed figures moving on their metal deck preparing to board. "This is the United States Coast Guard, Atlantic area," a voice like dead air murmured through a loudspeaker. "Identify yourself and state your emergency." "Daniel Morrison," I murmured over the hard wind back. "Crew member on this cargo vessel. Multiple casualties. I'm the only survivor." A boarding party of 4 officers came across on a small boat. They were armed and cautious, treating the situation as potentially hostile until they could assess what had happened. The team leader was a lieutenant commander named Rodriguez, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes like dim holes and a no-nonsense attitude. "Where's the rest of your hands?" she asked as soon as she stepped onto our metal deck. I led them to the container where the bodies were stored. Rodriguez took one, peered inside and immediately murmured for additional personnel and a crime scene team. The rats had been busy during the past few days, but the bodies were still recognizable. Jesus Christ, one of the younger officers muttered, covering his nose against the stink. And the captain? Rodriguez asked. I showed them Pike's body near the cleat where he'd fallen. The blood had dried to a dark stain on the metal deck, and his skin had taken on a waxy pallor in the bitter cold air. I killed him, I said quietly, simply. Self-defense. He was trying to murder me. Rodriguez studied the scene carefully, taking photographs and making notes. She had me walk through everything that had happened, starting from Ted going overboard and ending with Pike's death. I told her about the rules, the disappearing hands members, Ted's transformation, and the things I'd make out at the aft during the red light incidents. That's quite a story, Rodriguez said quietly when I finished. Her tone was neutral, neither believing nor dismissing what I'd told her. Check the container, I said quietly. Peered at the bodies. Ask yourself how 3 men ended up locked in there with dozens of rats. The crime scene team worked through the night, long and salt-brined, documenting everything and collecting evidence. They found Pike's key ring with the container keys, the destroyed radio equipment, and the blood evidence from his washing the lead-colored Dawn after Chen's supposed accident. By dawn, they'd transferred me to the Coast Guard cutter from Boston Station. I sat in a small cabin, wrapped in a blanket, and drinking scorched coffee that actually tasted like scorched coffee instead of the bitter sludge we'd been making on the cargo vessel. Through the porthole, I could make out our vessel being towed behind us, heading for port, and a full investigation. Rodriguez sat across from me, a digital recorder on the table between us. We'll need a complete statement when we reach port, she said quietly. The FBI will want to interview you as well. This is going to be a complex investigation. I nodded, too tired to care about the bureaucracy that was coming. What happens to the vessel? Evidence. It'll be impounded until we can figure out exactly what happened out there. She paused, studying my face. You really believe your hand's mate came back from the dead? I know how it noises, I said quietly. But I saw what I saw. Ted Kowalski died when he went overboard. Whatever came back wearing his face wasn't human. Rodriguez made a note in her file. The medical examiner will determine cause of death for all the victims. We'll know more then. I stared out the porthole at the gray water stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there, things moved in the deep places that were older than human civilization. Pike had made a deal with them, trading lives for safe passage. Now that arrangement was broken, and I was the only one left to tell the story. The Coast Guard cutter's engines hummed steadily as we headed toward port, carrying me away from the nightmare that had consumed 6 men and left me as the sole witness to their fate. Really scary stories, every day. Subscribe, like if you like, turn on the bell so you don't miss new videos.